Did people in the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, live longer than you think? Did they respect their elders or cast them aside? Get ready to explore the surprising world of old age in a time far removed from our... Number 10. The definition of old age was a moving target. When we talk about medieval old age, it is important to understand that the concept of old was not always tied to a specific number of years. While modern society often links old age to retirement at 65 or 70, medieval ideas were much more fluid. A person could be considered old at what we might think of as a relatively young age, depending on their physical condition, their social role, and even their economic status. Many medieval texts and legal documents provide clues about how age was perceived. Some scholars of the time divided human life into stages, often 7 stages, mirroring biblical interpretations or classical ideas. These stages might place the onset of old age anywhere from 40 to 60 years. For example, the 12th century philosopher Hugh of St. Victor, writing about the ages of man, described the final stage, senectus, as beginning around age 60. But other texts, or even everyday observations, would suggest that signs of physical decline, like gray hair, loss of teeth, or difficulty with manual labor, could mark someone as old much earlier. A peasant who had spent decades toiling in the fields, enduring harsh winters and subsisting on a basic diet, might experience significant physical wear and tear by their 40s or 50s, making them appear and feel much older than someone of the same chronological age in a different social class. Chronological age was sometimes important in legal matters. For instance, attaining majority, which meant being legally independent, usually happened around 12 to 15 years for girls and 14 to 21 years for boys, depending on the region and the specific legal system. But beyond these markers of legal independence, the concept of being old enough to stop working or to be cared for was less about a specific birthday and more about the individual's capacity. A person might be described as old and infirm in a will, or a monastic record indicating a state of being rather than a specific number of years. This meant that two people could be the same chronological age, yet one was considered old due to their physical state, while the other was not. The idea of old also carried different connotations. For some, old age was associated with wisdom, experience, and piety, especially for those who lived long and led virtuous lives. For others, it might be linked to infirmity, weakness, or a burden. These perceptions were not fixed and could change depending on the specific person, their social standing, and the immediate context. A wealthy lord, even if physically frail, might still command respect and influence due to his property and lineage, while a poor, sick, elderly person might struggle to find support. Records from medieval villages and towns often show people described as old in property transfers or court documents, but without a specific age given. Instead, the description focuses on their perceived capacity or incapacity. A person might grant their land to a younger relative because of their old age and inability to work the land themselves. This indicates that functionality, rather than merely counting years, was a primary determinant in who was considered old. The lines between middle age and old age were blurry, defined by the onset of visible signs of aging and a decrease in physical strength or mental sharpness. Even within religious orders, where records of age might have been more meticulously kept for administrative purposes, the emphasis often remained on the spiritual journey associated with aging. A monk or nun might be described as aged in their later years, signifying a period of profound spiritual reflection and preparation for death, rather than just a chronological milestone. The physical changes of aging, such as a stoop, a tremor, or failing eyesight, were often seen as clear indicators that a person had entered the final phase of life. regardless of whether they had reached 60 or 70 years. This fluid definition of old age suggests a society that adapted its understanding of aging to the lived realities of its people, where individual circumstances often outweighed rigid chronological markers. Number 9. Elders held significant social and economic power sometimes. Contrary to what some might imagine, medieval old age was not always a period of quiet retirement or vulnerability. For many, particularly those with property, status, or specialized knowledge, their later years could be a time of considerable influence and even power. The structure of medieval society, with its emphasis on hierarchy, tradition, and land ownership, often meant that older individuals, especially men, retained control of vital resources and decisions. In rural communities, which made up the vast majority of medieval society, land was the foundation of wealth and power. The patriarch of a family, often an older man, typically held the title to the family land or held the tenancy rights. This meant that his sons and daughters, even if they were grown adults with their own families, often remained dependent on him for access to the land they worked. This control over property gave older heads of household immense leverage. They could decide when and how to divide the land among their heirs, when to grant permission for marriages, and even whether to grant portions of their land in exchange for care in their old age. Wills and charters from the period frequently show older individuals dictating the terms of their legacies, ensuring their comfort and respect in their final years. For example, a father might agree to transfer his land to his son, but with the specific condition that the son provides him with a certain amount of grain, firewood, and a warm bed for the rest of his life. If the son failed to uphold the agreement, the land could revert back to the father. Such arrangements were common and indicate the significant economic power that older people could wield. Beyond land, accumulated knowledge and experience were also sources of power. In a world without widespread literacy or instant information, the wisdom of elders was highly valued. Older individuals often served as the living memory of a community. They could recall past harvests, advise on traditional farming techniques, remember local customs and precedents for disputes, and recount family histories. Village elders might be called upon to arbitrate disagreements, drawing on their long-standing familiarity with the individuals involved and the community's unwritten rules. Their counsel was sought on matters ranging from marriage alliances to land boundaries. Their experience gave them an authoritative voice in community affairs. In urban settings, older merchants and master craftsmen often retained control over their guilds and workshops. A master craftsman, having spent decades perfecting his trade, might hold the most prestigious position within his guild, overseeing apprentices and journeymen and controlling access to specialized knowledge. His experience and established reputation could be invaluable, allowing him to maintain significant influence over his trade and the economic life of the town. Records show guildmasters continuing to work and supervise well into their later years, their age viewed as a testament to their skill and expertise. Even within the church, age could confer authority. Bishops, abbots, and abbesses often served for many years their long tenure, building their experience and influence. Popes, by definition, were usually elected from among older cardinals, their advanced age seen as a sign of gravitas, wisdom, and spiritual maturity. For instance, Pope Gregory X, elected in 1271, was a respected figure. With extensive experience in the Church, his age added to his perceived wisdom. Many renowned scholars and theologians continued their intellectual pursuits into old age, their accumulated learning commanding respect in universities and monasteries. Figures like Thomas Aquinas, though he died relatively young by modern standards, was a respected scholar in his prime, and older scholars were consistently seen as fountains of knowledge. However, this power was not universal. It was largely dependent on social class, wealth, and gender. While an older lord or a wealthy merchant might maintain significant influence, An older peasant woman who had no property or family support might find herself in a far more precarious position, facing economic hardship. But for those with resources, old age was far from a period of automatic decline into powerlessness. Number 8. How old age was visually represented in art and literature. Medieval society had a complex and often contradictory view of old age, and this complexity was reflected powerfully in the art and literature of the period. Old age was not just seen as a decline. It was also associated with wisdom, piety, and the spiritual journey towards death. Visual representations varied, showing both the challenges and the revered aspects of growing old. In religious art, which made up a significant portion of medieval imagery, older figures were frequently depicted with honor and reverence. Saints, apostles, and prophets were often shown with long beards, flowing white hair, and deeply lined faces, their features conveying wisdom, experience, and a life dedicated to faith. For example, St. Peter is almost universally depicted as an old man, his bald pate fringed with white hair, and his face etched with age, symbolizing his seniority. Among the apostles and his role as the rock of the church, similarly, the evangelists, like St. John, sometimes depicted in his old age, on the island of Patmos, convey a sense of profound insight and spiritual depth. These portrayals suggested that old age was a time for spiritual growth, contemplation, and drawing closer to God. The physical signs of aging, wrinkles, a stooped posture, were often presented not as defects, but as visual markers of a long life, often in service to God. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is sometimes shown in her later years in scenes of her dormition, death, with features of age that convey a serene piety. However, not all artistic representations were purely positive. Some medieval artworks, especially those in more secular contexts or allegorical works, could portray old age with a sense of its physical decrepitude and the inevitable decline of the body. These depictions might emphasize weakness, illness, or the loss of former beauty and strength. In some moralizing tales or satirical images, older women might be shown as frail, particularly if they were perceived as trying to cling to youthful appearances or engaging in what was deemed unseemly behavior. Older men, too, could be depicted as senile, foolish, or miserly, especially in popular literature or marginalia, in manuscripts which sometimes contain humorous or critical social commentary. These contrasting images show that medieval perceptions of old age were not monolithic. In illuminated manuscripts, marginal illustrations sometimes included figures of the ages of man, where old age was shown as the final, often frail, stage. These depictions might feature an old man leaning on a staff, his back bent, or an old woman with a furrowed brow, reflecting the physical realities of aging in a pre-modern world without advanced medicine. The colors used for older figures could sometimes be muted or signify a nearing end. Literature also offered a range of portrayals. Works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales provide vivid characterizations, showing both the veneration and the occasional mockery of older individuals. The knight, for instance, is an older figure, highly respected for his experience and virtue. Yet the old woman in the Wife of Bath's tale is transformed into a young, beautiful woman, playing on perceptions of what is desirable. Romances and allegories often featured wise old hermits, or mentored, embodying ancient knowledge and spiritual guidance, such as Merlin from Arthurian legends, who is often depicted as an ancient. The Dance of Death, a popular allegorical motif that emerged particularly after the Black Death, frequently included figures of old men and women among its victims, emphasizing that death spared no one, regardless of age or status. In these images, old age was a precursor to death, a temporary state before the final reckoning. Yet even here, there was often a didactic message about spiritual readiness which older individuals were expected to possess. The visual language of old age was therefore rich and varied, reflecting the diverse experiences and cultural attitudes towards the later stages of life. Number 7. Spirituality and preparation for death shaped later years. For medieval people, life was inherently interwoven with the Christian faith, and this was especially true for the elderly. As individuals aged, their thoughts often turned more intensely towards their salvation, the afterlife, and the preparation for death. This spiritual dimension was not just a personal concern. It was deeply embedded in community practices, legal documents, and the daily rhythms of life. The Church taught that true old age was a time for reflection, penitence, and detachment from worldly concerns. It was a period to make amends for past sins, to deepen one's faith, and to prepare one's soul for the journey into the next world. Many older individuals would become more devout, attending church services, more frequently engaging in prayer, and seeking spiritual counsel from priests or monks. The sacraments particularly, confession and extreme unction, last rites, became increasingly significant as a person neared the end of their life. Receiving these sacraments was believed to cleanse the soul and provide spiritual comfort and strength for the passage from life to death. Wills provide some of the most compelling evidence of this spiritual focus. Medieval wills were not merely documents for distributing property. They were profoundly spiritual declarations. Testators often began their wills with a fervent prayer, commending their soul to God, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. They would typically allocate a significant portion of their wealth to religious causes. This included bequests to their parish church for masses to be said for their soul, donations to monasteries, cathedrals, or mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans. Money might be left for charitable works, such as feeding the poor or supporting hospitals, all with the explicit purpose of securing prayers for their soul and earning merit in the eyes of God. For instance, a wealthy merchant might leave funds for the construction of a new chapel or for a perpetual lamp to burn before a saint's altar, explicitly stating that these actions were for the good of his soul and the souls of his ancestors. Pilgrimages were another spiritual pursuit often undertaken by the elderly. While physically demanding, some older individuals, if their health and wealth allowed, would embark on pilgrimages to holy sites like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem. These journeys were acts of devotion and penance, seeking forgiveness for sins and offering prayers for a good death. Even if they could not undertake a long journey, local pilgrimages to shrines or relics were common. Some elderly people, particularly widows or those without direct family support, might choose to enter a monastery or convent in their later years. This provided a structured environment for prayer, spiritual contemplation, and a community to care for them. While not a retirement home in the modern sense, entering religious life offered a path for spiritual devotion and communal living in old age. There are records of elderly individuals, both men and women, taking monastic vows late in life, embracing a life of prayer and simplicity in preparation for death. The physical decline often associated with old age was frequently interpreted through a spiritual lens. Weakness, illness, and the nearing end of life were seen as reminders of the fleeting nature of earthly existence and the importance of focusing on the eternal. Illness was often viewed as a divine test or a means of purgation, a way to cleanse the soul before death. Consequently, older individuals were expected to embrace their suffering with patience and piety, offering it up to God. The medieval understanding of old age was therefore deeply intertwined with the prevailing religious beliefs, making the spiritual journey a central and defining aspect of the later years of life. Number 6. Family was often the primary retirement plan. In the medieval period, there were no state-sponsored pensions, no social security systems, and widespread institutional elder care was limited. For the vast majority of people, especially those without significant wealth or religious affiliation, the family unit served as the crucial safety net and primary source of support in old age. The expectation was that children, particularly sons, would care for their aging parents. This arrangement was not simply a matter of filial piety. It was often an economic necessity and a deeply ingrained social custom. Land, the most valuable asset for most medieval families, was typically passed down from one generation to the next. In many cases, older parents would begin to transfer their land or other assets to their children, especially their eldest son, in exchange for guaranteed care and maintenance for the rest of their lives. These arrangements, often formalized through written agreements or verbal contracts, witnessed by the community, provided a form of security for the elder. These agreements could be incredibly detailed, specifying the exact provisions the parents would receive. For example, a contract might stipulate that the parents would be given a certain amount of grain each year, a specific number of loaves of bread, a quantity of firewood, a designated room in the house, clothing, and even a fixed allowance of meat or ale. The agreement might also include provisions for medical care in times of illness or for a place at the fireplace in winter. The children would be legally bound to uphold these terms, and if they failed to do so, the parents could potentially reclaim their property or seek redress in local courts. Such arrangements ensured that parents, despite no longer being able to work the land themselves, would continue to receive the sustenance and shelter they needed. This system of family support was rooted in the concept of the household as the fundamental economic and social unit. The medieval household often extended beyond the nuclear family to include grandparents, unmarried, aunts and uncles, and sometimes even servants or laborers. Within this larger household, older members contributed in various ways, even if they could no longer perform heavy physical labor. Older women might take on tasks like spinning, weaving, childcare, or managing the household. Older men might mend tools, share their accumulated knowledge of farming or craftsmanship, or act as advisors. Their presence and experience were valuable even if their physical strength diminished. However, the effectiveness of this family retirement plan varied. It worked best in stable, prosperous families with multiple surviving children. If a family suffered from repeated bad harvests, illness, or if a child died prematurely, the burden on the remaining family members could be immense, potentially jeopardizing the care of elderly parents. Widows, in particular, could face challenges if they had no surviving adult children, or if their dower, the portion of her deceased husband's estate set aside for her support, was insufficient. Some widows might remarry to secure support or rely on extended kinship networks. The concept of a deathbed contract also existed, where an elderly person, nearing the end of their life, would grant their property in exchange for immediate care and a proper burial. This highlights the immediacy and personal nature of these arrangements. While tensions and conflicts could arise within families over these agreements, the underlying principle was that the family was responsible for its own, from birth through old age and death. This deeply ingrained social structure meant that for most medieval people, growing old meant relying on the next generation, a reliance that was often both a source of security and a complex web of mutual obligation. Number 5. Poverty and old age were a tough mix. While some elderly individuals held power or relied on robust family support, a significant portion of the medieval population faced extreme vulnerability in their later years, particularly if they were poor, had no family, or pauper from debilitating illness. For these individuals, old age often meant struggling with destitution, hunger, and homelessness. The medieval economy was largely agrarian and labor-intensive. If an older person, especially a peasant or a common laborer, lost the ability to work due to physical infirmity or illness, their source of income vanished. Without accumulated savings, valuable property to exchange for care, or children capable of supporting them, they were left with very few options. The average lifespan was shorter, and those who lived to old age often bore the physical marks of a life of hard labor, making continued work impossible. Arthritis, chronic pain, poor eyesight, and dental issues were common afflictions that would severely limit an older person's capacity to earn a living. Begging was a common and often accepted way for the poor to survive, and the elderly were frequently among those who relied on charity. Travelers and pilgrims would encounter older beggars on roadsides, outside churches, and in town squares. Giving alms to the poor was considered a Christian virtue, and many wills included bequests specifically for the poor of Christ, often meaning those who were unable to support themselves, which included many elderly individuals. However, relying on charity meant an unpredictable and often insufficient existence, subject to the goodwill of others. Some institutions did exist to provide care for the indigent, elderly, but they were not widespread and often served specific populations. Almshouses, sometimes founded by wealthy individuals, guilds, or monastic orders, offered basic shelter and sustenance for a small number of poor, often elderly, individuals. These almshouses were typically small, locally run establishments. Far from comprehensive social welfare programs, they often had strict rules, and admission could be competitive, requiring a patron or specific qualification. For instance, an almshouse might only admit elderly men who had served in a particular trade guild or elderly women who were members of a certain religious confraternity. The care provided was rudimentary, focusing on basic needs rather than extensive medical treatment. Guilds, particularly in urban centers, sometimes provided a limited form of social welfare for their elderly members. A guild might offer a small pension or support to an aging master craftsman or his widow, especially if they had contributed to the guild throughout their working lives. This was a form of mutual aid among members of a specific profession, not a general safety net. However, many laborers and peasants were not part of such formal organizations and had no access to these benefits. Widows, especially those without property or children, faced particular challenges. While dower rights were intended to provide for them, these could be insufficient or difficult to enforce. Some widows would be forced to remarry for economic security, even if they were elderly. Others might become live-in servants for wealthier families, performing light duties in exchange for food and shelter. The vulnerability of older women, who often outlived their husbands and were less likely to own land directly, was a significant concern in medieval society. The struggles of the poor elderly were often highlighted in sermons and religious texts which encouraged charity and compassion. However, the reality on the ground was that, for those at the bottom of the social ladder, old age often meant a deepening struggle for survival, marked by hunger, cold, and the constant threat of homelessness. Their experiences stand in stark contrast to those of the privileged few who could look forward to a comfortable and respected old age. Number 4. Some medieval people lived surprisingly long lives. When we talk about medieval life expectancy, it is easy to get caught up in the often quoted average age, which hovered around 30 to 40 years. This figure, however, is heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality rates, as well as deaths from disease, famine, and conflict that struck people of all ages. What this average often obscures is the fact that if a person survived the perilous years of childhood and adolescence, they had a significant chance of living into their 50s, 60s, or even beyond. Many individuals in the medieval period did live surprisingly long lives, reaching what would be considered old age even by modern standards. Historical records, though, fragmented offer glimpses of these long-lived individuals. Chroniclers, genealogies, wills, and legal documents occasionally mention people reaching advanced ages. For example, some monarchs and high-ranking nobles, often benefiting from better nutrition, less strenuous labor, and access to some form of medical care, though still rudimentary by today's standards, lived into their 70s or 80s. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, lived to be 82, 1122 to 1204, a remarkable age for any period. She was a politically active queen and mother of kings well into her later years. Another example is Blanche of Castile, mother of King Louis IX of France, who was a formidable regent and political force, living to 65, 1188 to 1252, and remaining influential until her death. Even among the common people, there are scattered records of individuals living to old age. While less documented than the elite, some peasants, craftsmen, and townspeople are mentioned in various registers as being in their old age or very old before their deaths. Parish records, when they exist and are sufficiently detailed, sometimes indicate ages that suggest lifespans extending into the 60s and 70s. For example, studies of specific manorial records might reveal individuals who were consistently listed in tax rolls or labor obligations over many decades, implying a long life. The physical evidence from skeletal remains also supports this, showing that while many people died young, a noticeable proportion of the population lived long enough for their bones to show signs of age-related wear and tear, like arthritis. The key factor for longevity was often survival past early childhood. If an individual avoided the common childhood diseases, accidents, and nutritional deficiencies that claimed so many young lives, their chances of reaching adulthood and then old age significantly increased. A robust constitution, a relatively stable environment, and freedom from constant warfare or famine could allow for a longer lifespan access to food, even if basic played a crucial role. A person who had a consistent food supply, even if simple, was more likely to weather illnesses and maintain strength than someone living on the brink of starvation. Some prominent figures known for their intellectual or spiritual contributions also lived long lives. Bede, the great Anglo-Saxon historian and theologian, lived into his early 60s, c. 672, 673, an impressive age given his period. Geoffrey Chaucer, the renowned English poet, lived to be around 60, Citry, 1343 to 1400, a good age, particularly as he lived through the aftermath of the Black Death. These individuals, often engaged in less physically demanding pursuits, could continue their work into their later years, their minds remaining active, even as their bodies aged. The presence of these long-lived individuals, though perhaps not the statistical average, demonstrates that old age was a tangible and sometimes extant period of life. For a significant segment of the medieval population. Number 3. Old age could bring respect or ridicule. The medieval perception of old age was not a single uniform idea. Instead, it was a complex tapestry, woven with threads of deep respect and at times sharp ridicule. This duality reflects the varied experiences and societal attitudes towards the elderly, depending on their status, gender, and personal conduct. On one hand, old age was often associated with wisdom, experience, and authority. The accumulated knowledge of a long life was highly valued in a society where oral tradition and personal memory were crucial. Older individuals, especially men, were often seen as patriarchs, community leaders, and repositories of local history and custom. Their gray hair and wrinkles could be symbols of sagacity and piety. In legal proceedings, the testimony of elders who could recall events or customs from decades past. Village meetings might defer to the oldest resident for advice on planting cycles, settling disputes, or understanding historical precedents. This respect was deeply rooted in the idea that long life itself was a sign of divine favor, or a testament to virtuous living. Religious texts often praised the wisdom of the elders, and figures like King Solomon or ancient prophets were depicted as wise old men. Older women, too, could command respect, especially as matriarchs within families, or as skilled healers and midwives. Their experience in managing households, raising children, and providing care was invaluable. Widows, if they had property and managed it well, could maintain a degree of independence and influence, sometimes even running businesses or estates. Figures like the abbesses of powerful convents, who were often elderly and highly experienced, wielded considerable spiritual and temporal power. However, the flip side of this veneration was the potential for ridicule and contempt, particularly if an older person did not fit societal expectations or if their physical decline was perceived negatively. Medieval literature, folklore, and popular humor sometimes depicted older individuals, especially women, in unflattering ways. The old hag archetype, portrayed as ugly, bitter, or even sexually perverse, appears in some tales. An older woman who tried to appear youthful or pursued romantic interests might be subjected to satire and mockery. These portrayals often reflected anxieties about women's sexuality and societal control. Similarly, older men could be satirized as foolish, senile, or lustful, particularly if they were perceived as losing their mental faculties or clinging to power despite their diminished capacity. Plays, fabliaux, short comical tales, and popular songs sometimes featured a gullible old man or a miserly old codger. The physical signs of aging, weakness, stooped posture, poor eyesight could also be grounds for mockery, highlighting the vulnerability and loss of former strength. This was especially true for those who were poor or had no social standing, as their physical decline offered no counterbalancing respect from wealth or status. The dual nature of medieval perceptions of old age also extended to proverbs and sayings. While some lauded the wisdom of age, others warned against its follies or its inevitable decline. The respect an older person commanded often depended on their social standing, their wealth, their gender, their continued usefulness to the community, and their adherence to societal norms. An aged abbot known for his piety and learning would be revered, while an impoverished, mentally frail elder might face neglect or derision. This complex interplay of reverence and mockery reveals that old age in the medieval period was a nuanced experience, not a simple universally positive or negative state. Number 2. Health and illness were a constant battle. Life in the medieval period was physically demanding, and for those who lived to old age, health and illness were constant companions. While we lack the detailed medical records of today, historical sources and skeletal evidence provide a glimpse into the physical realities of aging in a pre-modern world. The absence of modern medicine meant that many conditions that are manageable today posed significant challenges, making the physical decline of old age a profound and often painful experience. One of the most common afflictions of old age was musculoskeletal degeneration. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries frequently show evidence of osteoarthritis, a condition characterized by the breakdown of cartilage in joints. This would have caused chronic pain, stiffness, and reduced mobility in the hips, knees, spine, and hands, making everyday tasks like walking, lifting, or working incredibly difficult. For peasants who spent their lives performing strenuous agricultural labor, or craftsmen whose work involved repetitive motions, these conditions were almost inevitable by middle or old age. A bent back, a shuffling gait, and gnarled hands would have been common sights among the elderly. Dental health was also generally poor. Without modern dentistry, tooth loss due to decay, gum disease, or trauma was widespread. Many older individuals would have had few or no teeth, making chewing food difficult. This could lead to nutritional deficiencies if they were unable to eat a varied diet, further weakening their already aging bodies. The phrase, "old as a toothless crone," was not just a saying. It was a physical reality for many. Sensory decline was another significant challenge. Poor eyesight and hearing loss would have made it harder for older individuals to engage in daily activities, participate in conversations, or perform tasks requiring precision. In a world without corrective lenses or hearing aids, this meant increasing isolation or dependence on others. The ability to read even for the literate few would have become difficult in old age. Chronic illnesses, often exacerbated by poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, and lack of effective treatments, also plagued the elderly. Respiratory infections, digestive problems, and various fevers could be debilitating or fatal. While medieval medical texts did categorize diseases of old age, their understanding of underlying causes was limited, and treatments were often based on humoral theory, herbal remedies, or prayers, rather than scientific understanding. For instance, a medieval physician might attribute a person's weakness to an imbalance of humors and prescribe remedies like bleeding or purging. Fractures and injuries were also more serious for the elderly. Older bones, weakened by age or poor nutrition, were more susceptible to bricks and healing, was slower and more complicated. A fall could be life-threatening, leading to long periods of incapacitation or even death due to complications like infection. The cold, damp conditions prevalent in many medieval dwellings could exacerbate chronic conditions and contribute to respiratory illnesses. Despite these challenges, some older individuals continued to be active and contribute to their communities, demonstrating remarkable resilience. However, for many, old age was a period marked by persistent physical discomfort, increasing infirmity, and a heightened vulnerability to illness, making the battle for health a constant and arduous one. Number 1. The end of life was a community affair. In the medieval period, death was not the private, often institutionalized event it frequently is today. Instead, the approach of death, the dying process, and the subsequent mourning and burial rituals were profoundly public and communal. For an elderly person nearing the end of their life, their final moments were often shared with family, neighbors, and the wider community. When an elderly person became gravely ill, their bedside would often be surrounded by family members, close friends, and sometimes even neighbors. It was a time for farewells, reconciliation, and the passing on of blessings and final instructions. This communal presence provided comfort to the dying and ensured that their spiritual and worldly affairs were in order. This was especially true for the wealthier, whose wills and bequests would be witnessed and formalized at their deathbed, sometimes read aloud to the assembled company. The church played a central role in guiding the dying process. A priest would be summoned to administer the final sacraments, particularly extreme unction, anointing of the sick, and to hear the final confession. This ritual was not just for the individual. It was a public declaration of their faith and preparation for the afterlife. The priest would also lead prayers, and family members would join in creating a powerful spiritual atmosphere around the dying person. The belief in purgatory and the importance of prayers for the soul meant that the community had a vested interest in ensuring a good death for their elder. After death, the body was typically washed, prepared, and laid out in the home for a period, often on display for visitors to pay their respects. This viewing allowed neighbors and acquaintances to come and offer condolences, reinforcing community bonds. The funeral procession itself was a public spectacle, often involving many people from the village or town. The deceased would be carried to the church and then to the burial ground, accompanied by mourners, priests, and sometimes professional mourners or bell ringers. The sound of church bells tolling would announce a death to the entire community, signaling a collective moment of pause and remembrance. Burial typically took place in consecrated ground, usually the churchyard or within the church itself. For the wealthy or important individuals, the act of burial was often witnessed by many, emphasizing the communal aspect of life and death. Prayers would be said over the grave, and sometimes a feast or wake would follow, allowing the community to mourn together and celebrate the life of the deceased. These gatherings reinforced social ties and provided comfort to the bereaved family. Beyond the immediate ceremonies, the memory of the deceased elder would often be kept alive through ongoing prayers and memorial masses. Many wills included provisions for annual masses to be said for the soul of the deceased, or for charitable donations to be made in their name on their anniversary. This ensured that the elder's spiritual well-being was cared for even after death, and that their memory continued to be a part of the community's shared life. The death of an elder was therefore not just a private grief, it was a community event, marking a transition in the social fabric and reinforcing the collective faith and interconnectedness of medieval society.